You walk through the door after a day's work and your entire life is shattered. Your new wife and unborn baby are dead. Police zero right in on you as a suspect as a mysterious stranger lurking about the neighborhood is sought for questioning. The murder goes cold for over 60 years. But a detective determined to solve the case, not even born when the murders occurred, steps up and suddenly the answer to 2 murders is staring right back at her. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and true crime author. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. A civilian clerk at the Van Nuys National Guard Station in the San Fernando Valley area of California, 20-year-old Joe Jepson could not have been happier during the winter of 1956. Joe had just married the love of his life, Barbara Jean, an 18-year-old local gal, 4 months pregnant with their first child. Barbara is beautiful and kind, generous and loving, personifying that 1960s look. Dark black, wavy hair propped up in a perfect bouffant. Pencil-thin eyebrows, dark red lipstick, porcelain skin, and a smile that screamed of a happiness that could only come from living her greatest life. It's January 31st, 1956, 7:45 a.m., and Joe Jepson kisses Barbara Jean goodbye and then clocks in for work 30 minutes later. Barbara is at home, alone, preparing the house for the arrival of their child in just 5 short months. Near 12:30 p.m., Barbara decides to head out shopping. Several of the Jepsons' neighbors later report Barbara back home near 1:30. But at about 2:20, she leaves again after forgetting something at the store. Not gone long, Barbara is back home within the hour, which is when, police later say, someone Barbara knows pops in for a visit. When Joe walks in near 5 p.m., it's clear that something is just not right. Barbara has not greeted him at the door, as she normally does. Then Joe turns a corner in the small apartment and heads into the couple's bedroom. It's there that Joe's entire world crumbles in one moment. Barbara Jean is nude, on the floor, blood all around her. The handle of a bent butcher knife sticking out of her bare chest. Just a gruesome scene. Joe panics and runs out of the apartment screaming, quote, "Somebody murdered my wife." The landlady, hearing the commotion, comes out, sees the terror on Joe's face, and calls police. Upon arriving at the apartment, Van Nuys police officers pull Joe aside and begin questioning him. Barbara's killer, I'm going to tell you right now, is not Joe Jepson. And despite decades of raised eyebrows and whispers about Joe, his innocence is established immediately. Joe has a rock-solid alibi. He was at work. It's clear that Barbara was murdered not long after she returned home from that second trip out. Law enforcement figures her death took place 4 p.m. And Joe was without a doubt still at work then, with plenty of witnesses to back him up. And there's one more important piece of evidence available. That second trip Barbara made had been for something special. In the bedroom, cops find a brand new gold wedding band purchased at 2:30 p.m. that same day at a local jewelry store. You see, Joe wore an inexpensive wedding band, and Barbara had always talked about getting him a real ring. It was supposed to be a surprise, which speaks volumes about the love these two shared. As neighbors are interviewed, several mention a young man lurking in an alley behind the apartment that afternoon. He's described as 21 to 23 years old, blonde, husky, wearing suntan trousers and a white shirt. Where Barbara is found in the couple's small bedroom, most of her clothes are lying beside her body and partially underneath the bed. One of her nylon stockings is bound around her wrists. There seems to be no signs of a struggle in the bedroom or any other part of the apartment. The closet door, though, it's open. There are bloodstains found on some of the clothes hanging in the closet, and it appears that her killer went through the garments, perhaps looking for something. A bloodstained jacket is located in the garage, in the rear of the apartment. A few neighbors report that around 3:30 that afternoon, they heard angry voices coming from inside the Jepsons' apartment, along with very loud music playing. In typical 1950s hysteria fashion, the headlines above the fold, scrawled at the top of all the local newspapers, tagged Barbara's homicide, the Valley Bride murder. There is a massive manhunt underway for what are 4 separate suspects, one of whom is an ex-boyfriend of Barbara's. Another, that husky blonde youth said to be lurking around the apartment building at the time of the murder, as well as a few local troublemakers. None of those leads or interviews go anywhere as far as an arrest is concerned. In fact, the case goes cold. Very cold. But then a break. 2 years after Barbara's murder, a 25-year-old dude from Missouri, Frank Neil Rippey, is arrested in Culver City, California, 20 minutes south of Van Nuys, after he confesses to killing Barbara. Prior to this, his only criminal record was a charge of selling mortgaged furniture. Rippey tells police he killed Barbara with a bread knife. They check out where Rippey was on the day of Barbara's murder, and as it turns out, he was working just a short distance from the Jepsons' apartment. The pieces all seem to fit, but more investigation is required before they feel charges can be brought. Complicating matters, another guy, Edward Simon Ween, a 33-year-old painting contractor, is then thought to have murdered Barbara because he looks very similar to the guy in the sketch generated by those who saw the dude lurking outside the Jepson apartment that afternoon. Ween had wound up on San Quentin's death row for an unrelated kidnapping and rape. Good candidate there. But upon further investigation, nothing else links Ween to Barbara's murder. Rippey, meanwhile, after being asked to describe the scene and some of the facts known to only law enforcement, gets just about everything wrong, and they realize he is trying to take credit for a murder he could not have committed. So, it's back to square one. Look, the 1950s weren't the greatest time in history to be solving murders. Fingerprint evidence was at best in its infancy then and very much untrusted. And there were even more problems when prosecutors took fingerprint evidence into a courtroom. The method of lifting trace evidence from a crime scene with tape had just been developed in the mid-50s. Blood grouping or typing had also just been established. Murder solving then was mainly about collecting circumstantial evidence. But most murders solved during this period were solved by a confession. The years pile up. Barbara Jean's murder is so brutal and violent, it continues to rock this otherwise quiet community. A pregnant housewife, middle of the day, at home, is butchered. People lock their doors and raise an eyebrow to anyone and everyone. Her murder changed everything in this community. 6 years into the investigation, 1962, Daniel Cedilos, who had confessed to viciously killing a 16-year-old California girl, is questioned about Barbara's murder and a second homicide, that of Marianne Pedrotta, a 15-year-old child who had been found along a horse trail in Sylmar, California in 1960. Sylmar is directly north of Van Nuys, about a 15-minute drive in northern San Fernando. Marianne was killed on November 24, 1960, found strangled and stabbed 9 times. She had been riding her horse near the edge of Whitney Canyon Park. A 10-year-old girl happened to come across her body while she was out on the trail and noticed Marianne's horse just wandering around. Sedilos is 34. He's a laborer. And that victim that he was arrested for killing, he buried in the same area where Marianne rode her horse. So they now believe he likely killed Marianne, which would in turn put him on the radar for Barbara Jean's murder because of the proximity, brutality, and circumstances. With Sedilos, they think they got their guy. After some digging, cops realize Sedilos, a very bad human in his own right, don't get me wrong about that, is not the monster they are looking for in Barbara's or Marianne's murders. What's significant here is that both of these murders feel different to law enforcement in a way that both seem very much premeditated, not simple random acts of violence. So again, Barbara's and now Marianne's murder go cold. Over the years, dozens of detectives look at both cases, re-interview witnesses and suspects, searching for that one overlooked piece of information or perp who stands out. But no arrest is made, and law enforcement does not feel any closer to solving either case. Who took young Barbara's life and the life of her unborn child? Marianne's murder seems even more unlikely to be solved based on the lack of any evidence whatsoever besides some trace forensics, which technology has not yet caught up to. I know where most of you, same as me, might think this case is heading. Toward the forensic genetic genealogy fountain of eternal case solving. It has that sense to it, right? But stick with me. This one is different. And when we come back from a short break, you'll meet a detective, not even born when either murder took place. She is given a book of documents associated with Barbara's case on the first day she enters the LAPD cold case unit. And she's sort of laughed at by her new male colleagues who believe there is no way she can solve this case. And yet, as she begins to reinvestigate Barbara's murder in 2018, the answer stares right back at her. An answer that was there all along from the very beginning. Be right back. Six decades. That is how long we are talking about since the murders of Marianne Pedrotta and Barbara Jean Jepson. No resolution. 60 years is a long time for families to wait for justice. I imagine they get to a point where they've given up hope the case will ever be solved. But then, well, a rare type of police officer suddenly steps into your life. And you know what? Everything changes. I'd like to introduce someone. 50-year-old LAPD detective Rachel Evans, who came across both of these cases when she joined one of LAPD's cold case units. Detective Evans is a kind of a rare breed, a special kind of investigator. I've met very few like her throughout my long career. Homicide investigation is what Rachel Evans is supposed to be doing. There is no doubt about that. It was kind of on a whim that Rachel wound up in one of LAPD's cold case units after bouncing around the department for several years. Here she is.
I had known the lieutenant of homicide because I had worked along with him when I worked for I was a commander's aide. So I worked with some of the bigwigs of the department, like in the Valley, because there's 4 bureaus. It's kind of a lot, but there's 4 bureaus. And I worked Valley Bureau and I worked with commander's aide. So I worked with the captains and the chiefs and different things of that area. So the lieutenant knew me, and then I made detective. And so I moved over to another unit and I worked detective stuff. I did like thefts and robberies and things like that. So the lieutenant would say like, hey, someday you got to come work for me. I'm like, yeah, for sure. But like not really knowing if that's what I would do in life. You know what I mean? And so he asked me one day, like, hey, when's your probation over? And I said, next month. And he goes, are you going to come work homicide or what? And I said, sure, I'll do that. Because I didn't really know, I kind of like go with the flow. And I'm like, I like detective work. I just don't, I knew I didn't like the basic stuff. I liked more complex things. Like I loved robbery. I loved working the robbery table. I didn't like working the theft table, right? So you learn kind of like, I at least want to do some legit investigation, not this person slapped me and I slapped him back. So he asked me to come work for him. I said, sure. And he said, because you're kind of a newer detective, I'm going to put you in cold case to get you kind of like to learn about it. And then if you want to go fresh, you can. And I said, okay, sounds good. And I'm the only girl in that squad. And there's 3 old timers. Like they all are getting ready to retire. In fact, all of them have retired since. And they didn't know me and didn't want me.
Hearing about this kind of sexism and narrow-mindedness, it really riles me, unnerves me. How dare these men question and not welcome with open arms this rookie detective, the future of the unit? One of the biggest obstacles in some cases, in some departments, is ego. That pride-filled, bloated male ego. And yet, you overlook it all, and you go about doing the job you are there to do.
So I walk in, and the lieutenant says, "Hey, here's your new partner, Evans." And they're like, "Okay, whatever." They're kind of like, they're not rude, but they're just kind of like, "Nice to meet you," but they don't really care so much. So one of them hands me this book, and he said, "Here's the oldest case in the valley. Good luck." And they turn around and work on their computers. Don't say a word to me, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh! Like, what am I supposed to do with this?" So they basically ignore me, and I'm like, I guess I'll start reading this book. And now, mind you, with cold case, what's hard is that you can look at it and say, like, they've already done everything. They have the case. They already did it. But always fresh eyes are good. You know what I mean? Like, because you might see something different. You might notice something different. And that's exactly what happened. One of the guys who had 15 years on, he had looked at this case and tried to solve it and couldn't find anything. And so I start reading, and I read through it, the whole book. And these books are extensive. It's a lot of detective work. A lot of these guys back in the day were awesome. They didn't have all the technology we have today, and they just had to like pound the pavement and talk to people, and they did so much work. And so I read through all the work that they did.
The more Rachel looks at the material, the clearer things become. For one, she spots a direct connection between Barbara's case and Marianne's. And in addition, she begins to develop a sense that perhaps there is a serial killer at work here. Rachel not only read through everything in the case file once, but several times. There is clarity in repetition, isn't there? Repeating things gets us familiar with the details and the missed details. All of us understand this, but when you apply this rule to crime solving, it becomes one of your most productive assets. Facts you just gleaned over the first time might just pop out a second or third time around. And then there is the issue of technology catching up to the cases. You can now apply new technology to an otherwise stagnant case. And I might add here, before we hear more from Rachel, these detectives in the cold case unit had every opportunity to solve this case.
And as I read through it the first time, then I went back the second time, and now I started taking notes. Oh, who's that guy? What's this? What's that? And I started taking notes on it. And then I went through the third time, and I kind of like weeded out the things that were important, the things that weren't. And I was like, okay, I'm going to start talking to people.
Immediately, Rachel discovers an important piece of information in Barbara's case, and it appears no one else noticed this. There was no forced entry, and there was no struggle inside the apartment on the afternoon she was murdered. This told Rachel Barbara likely knew her killer and probably let him in. An issue for cold cases, as we say a lot, is person power. Fresh cases come in, and those always take priority over the ones you're stuck on. But a department with a cold case unit, like the LAPD, has dedicated investigators working on unsolved murders. And that's when you see action. Rachel begins reading all the interviews done over the years with witnesses and suspects. The other fact she learns, which was rarely reported, but assumed by most everyone, is that Barbara Jean had been raped. In trying to track down people to talk to, however, Rachel runs into a huge problem.
Yeah, so I start looking up, again, 1956, a lot of people have died. So I start looking at people like, okay, well, who would be associated with her family? Who would know her? And I find cousins, and I find Joe Jepson, her husband, I find his sons. And, a lot of people will say, like, why even bother? Like, everybody's dead. Who cares? But, when I contacted Joe's sons, they were so grateful. Those guys are like, hey, when we come to LA, we want to meet you, because they're so grateful that somebody exonerated their father, even though he was already exonerated. They have been living, they're in their 50s. They have been living their whole life with their dad having this dark cloud over him. Like, it is these victims need help. Their families need help. Even beyond, 50, 60 years, it still hurts them.
Although there was no chance Joe Jepson could have killed Barbara, he was never fully believed by the public. Everyone looked at him differently. Until it was solved, he was going to be the guy. Then we talk about the victim's family. And Joe Jepson, regardless of what people thought, well, he was part of that family.
Like, it still hurts them. They still are haunted by so many things. It was never solved. It bothers them. Joe Jepson's mother, they said that she got True Detective magazines and was always trying to figure out what happened and would never let it go. And it bothered him. He'd say, Mom, let it go.
As Rachel is rereading interviews and talking to those who are still alive, a name emerges. Over and over, she begins seeing the name Mers, Monty R. Mers, who happens to be Barbara Jean's stepfather. Here's how Mers has been described. Quote, an avid gambler, prolific child molester, violent to animals, a womanizer, and raging alcoholic. End quote. That's one toxic, violent mix of psychopathy. Mers came into Barbara Jean's life when she was 10 years old. He married her mother, Fern Spiva, and they lived in the San Fernando Valley in 1948. Mers had 5 wives throughout his life. And let me tell you, there are horror stories attached to each one of them. Rachel told me she believes Mers groomed and molested Barbara along the way. Mers had a track record of marrying women with young daughters and molesting those kids. The guy was a real shitbag. I mean, let's just put it out there plainly. And fits the profile of what I'd say is a typical serial killer. Mers could not maintain any type of relationship. His personality disorders always got in the way. Yet he was so intimidating, those he victimized were always scared to say anything. And here's something else. If we go back to the murder of Marianne Pedrotta, Mers was known to have often ridden horses with Marianne. Then, as Rachel is going through the more contemporary information collected in the cases, she comes across a statement from one of Mers's many stepdaughters, who was so terrified of this scumbag, she waited until he died to come forward and tell her story. In 2017, this former stepdaughter calls into the LAPD to report that on the day Marianne was murdered, she specifically recalls Mers walking into the house with a bloody knife, blood on his hands, and all over his clothing. He had just come from the horse barn where Marianne and he would often run into each other. Now, Detective Rachel Evans can see in the documents that Monty Mers had been questioned about both murders in 1965, but the investigators did not have any evidence at the time to tie him directly to either case and had to let him go.
So I start contacting family members, cousins, the sons, whatever. And it's interesting, the two of her cousins who were 10 or 11 at the time, I said, hey, what did you think happened? And both of them separately said, we all believe Mont Mertz did it.
His name was such a forgotten piece of the puzzle that Rachel, although she'd run into it while reevaluating the cases, had not really placed it at the top initially. So when the cousins point this out, Rachel takes a second look deeper into who this guy is.
When I'm reading about Mont Mertz, he's arrested for a child molestation in 1965. 1964, he's arrested for child molestation. And they ask him, and then the detectives have this in 1964 and 1965, they ask him, hey, what, did you know Barbara Jepson? Or he also killed a girl named Marianne Pedrotta in 1960. And so they ask him about both girls, and he, of course, says, I don't know them. I don't know who they are.
Monty Mers knew they were onto him. Detectives were applying pressure. And when they did that, Mers does the unexpected. Although it does fall in line with what my research has shown some serial killers do at this stage of their murder sprees, it still shocks everyone involved. Let's take one more short break and come right back and wrap this up. Mers never admitted to either murder. Instead, he offs himself. But not because of guilt. You see, Mers was at home one day. He's with his fifth wife, Ina. She had found a young girl's panties in a drawer inside their Sylmar, California home and confronted Mers about it. So Mers chases his wife out of the house with a gun, shoots, and kills the woman. Then he goes back into the house and blows his head off. Kills himself. Good. I'm glad.
I think they were onto him a long time ago, but he killed himself, so then there was no way to follow up with that. I wanted to read one of the things they say. They say in their conclusion about Montmertz, the similarity in types of murders and suspects' acquaintance with both victims, plus his criminal activity towards young girls, would indicate that he is involved in these two murders. But due to lack of evidence to substantiate these suspicions, the cases were not submitted for prosecution.
That statement Rachel just read was written on July 28, 1964. Mers was given a polygraph on July 20 of that same year and registered as having guilty knowledge of both murders, Marianne's and Barbara's. Mers' suicide doesn't stop Rachel, however, from wanting to close the cases and definitively tie Mers to both. So she presses on. In Barbara's case, there was a bloody rag found inside a bathroom sink, and Rachel believes that Mers caught his finger killing Barbara. That rag, however, same as a bloody pillowcase found in the Jepson's bedroom, was never collected, bagged, and tagged as forensic evidence. The only thing left are photographs of the items. So Rachel does a complete examination of who Monty Mers was and his background.
As I started looking into Montmertz's background, like, who is he? What's he about? And man, that's when I uncovered just story after story of abuse and pain and like what the people went through that were in his life was really hard. And you realize, like, this is a bad guy.
As Rachel looks closer at all the evidence in the Jepson murder, she comes back to that bloody jacket I mentioned earlier in the show. Remember? The one found in the Jepson's garage. It appears that Mers might have worn that jacket when he murdered Barbara. So Rachel checks, and the jacket was collected, and they still have it in the evidence locker. 60 years later. She also finds out there are a few hair follicles on the jacket.
So here's what I did. There's a couple things going on. So I found his living son. He had a living son. He had a son and a daughter in their 80s. The daughter had died, I think she was 84 or 85. The son was 83 or 84, and I found that he was up in Utah. So I fly out to Utah and I get his DNA. And I thought this was interesting. It was hard to get his DNA because in LA, we can get people's DNA, no problem. I give a search warrant and say, this is what I need. And the judge says, okay. I went to Utah and they kind of gave me a hard time about it because they're worried that I'm going to put the son's DNA into a database, for bad guys. And I had to explain to them, I'm not doing that. I'm just testing for familial DNA. I'm going to see if the DNA matches up with any DNA from the crime scene. So I had to explain that to them, and they finally said, okay, we'll let you go get it. I thought it was pretty awesome. The judge actually in Utah told me, Utah's a state where the people have the say, not the government.
And good thing she collected that DNA when she did, because the son dies 2 weeks after Rachel's trip out to Utah. It feels like there is great momentum here, and I love when cases seem to be missing one particular piece of a puzzle, and when it is found, the picture comes into clear view. But in the real world of police work, that's not how cases go, sadly.
The problem is that there's DNA has something called loci, LOCI. You have to have enough of that to process, to correlate and make sure that it matches. And there's still not enough. Our technology isn't there. So even though I have it, I have the son's DNA, and even though we have the clothing items and things like that, it's still, we can't totally verify it yet because our technology isn't there yet, but it is getting better. So in time, we'll resubmit it and try again. But what happened was the department looked through my report and everything that I found out about him and what the detectives did back in the day. And the department basically says, we agree he did it, and they cleared it.
In the department's eyes, they closed the case and concluded Monty Mers murdered Barbara Jean Jepson and her unborn child, as well as Marianne Pedrotta.
And I believe he did it. It's just a matter of, we still have to prove that DNA, which I can't do until the processing gets better. He was a monster, total monster. If you think about it, he killed Barbara Jean Jepson. He killed Marianne Pedrotta. He killed Barbara Jean Jepson was 4 months pregnant. He killed the baby. That's considered another homicide. He killed his wife, and then he killed himself. So those are what we know of, right? I got an email that someone said, hey, I think your suspect, Montmertz, also killed a lady and it's buried in this area here. And I'm like, well, I can't dig up someone's yard 70 years later. You know what I mean? I have to know.
The best part of this is that the families have some answers. Not justice, but they can maybe let go of uncertainty. And I'll just add my own personal opinion. Andy's dead.
I have to tell you, like, there's opposition in all things, right? Like, if there's cold, there's also hot. If there's happy, there's sad. When you work something like this and it's really, really hard, and then you get the results and it's really good, it's really, really rewarding, right? Like, it's totally like, man, I worked my butt off and we got to have a resolution to this. And to help the families have some peace is the best thing ever.
That's what it is. Peace. Their loved ones can rest in peace. That's it for this week. Be back next week with another case. As always, be safe, be aware. Sources for today's episode include my interview with LAPD Detective Rachel Evans, Girl Slayer quizzed in 2 Valley killings, San Fernando Valley News, January 24, 1962. Widen search for killer of VN Bride, Valley Times, February 2nd, 1956. Police question 4 in murder of Valley Bride, Valley Times, February 1st, 1956. Crossing the Line is produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Talk Boom Productions. Written and executive produced by me, M. William Phelps, with Catherine Law. Audio mixing and mastering by Matt Russell.